The temperature is nice and warm in the Boiling Point podcast studio, so come on in, get cozy, and let's enjoy the conversation. We empower leaders through thoughtful discussions to positively impact our world. Our host, Dave Vale, founder and CEO of Vision Coaching Inc., is highlighting how we can thrive in business communities. Our conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, and inspirational storytellers are shining a spotlight on empowerment. Joining Dave this week is our special guest host, Emily Rodger. Let's join the conversation with Dave and Emily.
Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Boiling Point. I just started to kick things off, Emily. I hope that's okay.
Go to it.
I want to catch up on your the last 90 hours really quickly. We've got an awesome guest, a really interesting topic. You may notice that I'm speaking slower than in previous podcasts. One in particular, Emily and I interviewed my father, Ron Vale, former Chief Justice. I listened to it. I was talking so fast, and I don't know if I was nervous or excited or what, but and Emily, you showed up and you were just like, clean, and Ron showed up really well. And then I'm like, who's this bumbling guy? So I'm going to make an effort to talk slowly. And Emily, can you keep me accountable, please?
I don't know if I should be the one. I feel like I am the one that always gets excited and talks super fast. So it's funny that you notice that about yourself, because I feel like I'm always here, and it takes a conscious effort to be like, okay, Emily, bring it down.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that. And the other thing is I was doing a lot of this, so it's funny how tough we can be on ourselves. And it's hard to be human, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Your last 90 hours, Emily. Tell us, anyone watching this, I mean, if people are listening to it, anyone watching it will notice that you look like fresh and relaxed, and yet you've just come off 90 hours of travel.
I did. I left La Junta, Chile, Sunday morning at 8 a.m. and flew into Fredericton this morning at 3 a.m. And I've been all over the world, but it's like, that's the story of my life. It's like, this is so normal. And so I was in Chile fly fishing at a lodge down there that I had been to before. And if for any of the listeners who don't know, I am an avid angler and love to search for fish. And a lot of the times it brings me to very remote destinations. But it was funny because two of the people who I brought 3 guests down to the lodge, and 2 of them, actually all of them, it was their first time to South America. And they were saying about how this was the most remote they've ever been. And while we were down there, I mean, for me, I had been there before. There's kind of that feeling of like, just knowing the place, knowing the people, knowing the rivers, and it not feeling far from home. But then when it takes you 90 hours to get home, it's like, oh yeah, this is pretty far from home.
Yeah, well, and what a distance to go. Hopefully we're at the tail end of the pandemic here, but you made it there and back successfully. I can't wait to hear more about it.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was certainly worth sharing. And it just actually, I don't know if we've done this before, but if people that are interested in learning more about, what you do in terms of fly fishing, how do they find out more about that?
Yeah, so for hosted trips that I do, the information is usually on my personal website, Emily S. Rodger, RODGER.com. And that's where I have some of my upcoming hosted trips posted. Sometimes I'll post about them on LinkedIn, or people can just kind of email me. A lot of the times what people will do is email and say, hey, if you have a saltwater destination coming up, or if you're heading back to the jungle sometime soon, I'd love to join you on that trip. So I kind of have a list of people knowing what specific species of fish they want to target. And then I usually kind of make travel plans from there. So
cool. Okay. Well, I got to take you up on that at some point.
Yeah.
And I know Yukon's a destination. I don't know if I necessarily want to go there. I'd want to go somewhere else, but we can talk about that later. Let's bring our guest in. And I got this wonderful email from Ted, and you can see Ted here, Ted Cadsby. and he'd been listening to the podcast, and he was has some really good research and writing that he thought would be valuable here. And I tell you, I read this and I went, how quickly can we get him on? But it took a few months. Sorry, Ted. As you know, it's best when our guests introduce themselves. So would you kindly introduce yourself to our
I'd be happy to do that. Yeah. My name's Ted Cadsby. I'm a recovering bank executive. I ran a number of the wealth management businesses at one of Canada's largest banks, CIBC, and then ultimately ran its retail distribution function, the branches across the country, and some of its international operations. And I left the bank and kind of diversified my portfolio of activities to include corporate directorships, a lot of, interestingly enough, a lot of lecturing and writing on leadership at the universities here, two of them in Toronto, Ryerson, Ted Rodger School of Business, and Rotman, U of T. And I advise high net worth clients on their investments. So, the spike of my expertise in banking was wealth management. So that's kind of my bread and butter is advising wealthy individuals on how to manage their money. But I also have an interest in the human condition. When I was at CIBC, I wrote 2 books on investing, but they were geared towards the psychology of investing. And when I left the bank, I wanted to write a book on complexity and leadership and how poorly people in general, not just in business, but in general, how poorly people handle complex problems. So I wrote that book, Closing the Mind Gap, which was published in 2012. And then I wanted to write more and dig deeper into the human condition in a more broader sense, not just in terms of how we struggle with complexity, and not as it relates specifically to business and leadership, but on a day-to-day basis. And that's the culmination of my most recent book called Hard to Be Human, Overcoming Our 5 Cognitive Design Flaws. And it came out just last October, 2021, published by Dundurn Press. And I've been having a lot of fun engaging in the kind of conversations we're going to have today, talking about what makes it hard to be a human being. And more importantly, what tools do we have at our disposal to make it a little bit easier? Because no one wants to read a book. In fact, a few friends and colleagues of mine said, why would I want to read that sounds like a real downer. Why would I want to read a book about how hard it is to be a human being? I already know it's hard to be human. And I said, well, there's probably aspects of it that you don't quite understand. I didn't understand until I did all the research and thinking about it and interviewing for it. But half of the book is solution oriented. So I've structured as in the 5 cognitive design flaws: problem, solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. So what are the 5 big problems and what are the 5 big solutions for each of these problems? And it's been a lot of fun, and it's got some real traction with curious, intellectually minded, self-reflective people. It's the kind of topic you either really take to and you're interested in and you want to do a deep dive on and talk about, or not your cup of tea. So it's been very satisfying engaging with the people for whom it resonates.
Well, I think I know I'm in the camp, and I'm guessing Emily's in the camp of very curious to learn more. And I can't help but say and we've just met, but in listening to you, I kind of think of myself as you'd be an awesome friend to have and to go for dinner with, because you could just dig into your thinking, and you could be so much learning, and I imagine fascinating conversations. So Emily, what struck you when you read this email from Ted and saw a little bit of his work?
I was like, let's get into it. I want to know the design flaws. I want to know the solutions.
Yeah.
And actually, but on that, could I and I think what I find interesting is, when you think of the people stock market example and decisions that are made. What I understand is often a lot of it's based on emotion.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And generally people lose a lot of money because they're too emotional about their decision making. That's my understanding, and it's not my expertise, but that's my sense in my own case. And that's why I don't manage my portfolio, because I just make bad decisions, and I don't, it's completely, it's not logic, it's associated. So there must be some seeds or origins of this book in helping people invest money.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to the concept, because it's where it all started for me personally, was a deep curiosity and almost a confusion around why people made such obvious investment mistakes. Obvious to me as someone who's, spent a lot of his education on developing expertise in investing, and ultimately managing wealth management businesses, but not obvious to people who are investing on a day-to-day basis. And it comes down to two things, I think, that, interestingly enough, I would relate to some of the concepts of Buddhism. The first is exactly what you mentioned, Dave: overreaction, very emotional. And we can do a bit of a deep dive on this, because it's one of the most fascinating things about being human beings, is that we overreact and we're very emotional to pretty much everything. And there's a whole psychological basis for that. So let's park that for 1 second. I'll come back to it, because it's certainly one of the things that makes it hard to be human. But the second aspect of it that relates to Buddhism, in my mind, is that the Buddha was very clear that one of the reasons we overreact, one of the reasons we're so emotional, is because we don't understand the nature of reality. And when it comes to investing, I would add to what you say, Dave, that it's not just that we're very emotional and that makes us bad investors. It's that we don't understand how markets work. We don't understand the inherent randomness in stock prices. We tend to overinterpret noise as opposed to filtering it out well from signal, meaningful information. And so investing is, in a sense, a microcosm of everything that makes it difficult to be human. And when I reflected on what the key messages from Buddha was, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't, I could see that not applying just to investing, but to the human condition in general, is that we're very reactive biologically for good reasons to avoid threats. And we don't necessarily understand the true nature of reality and how it works. We oversimplify. We see a version of reality that works for us on a day-to-day basis, but doesn't work for us with anything that's a little more complex or challenging. And our long history encouraged us and was successful because we were able to oversimplify the world and see it in a very simple, superficial way, because our problems were pretty basic and pretty straightforward. Today, unfortunately, our problems and our situation is very complex on multiple levels, and the same kind of simple, intuitive way of managing problems that worked for us for eons throughout our evolution don't work as successfully for us today in this environment that we're in. So maybe just a way to close off, and then I'll turn it back over to you and see what you want to explore in more detail. We've got these complex brains. That's the root of the human condition. And they're complex in a way different than other animals because they create a lot of internal conflict for us. Other animals don't worry about their diets and how slim their figure is and what other animals are thinking of their physiques. So they don't worry about what they're eating. They just eat whatever's available and enjoy it until they're full. And that's one example of how the complexity of the human brain is such that we have these internal conflicts within us. So that's one downside of the complexity of a human brain. The other element I've already touched on, which is that the brain was designed for a world that was harsh, but that sent pretty clear signals on how to survive. Today, the world is less harsh for most of us, at least in the developed world, but the signals are not very clear on how we can be happy and thrive, because we've got all this noise coming at us from social media, and the complexity of our problems don't compare to the simplicity and straightforwardness of the challenges that we were kind of groomed by natural selection to cope with. So I'm throwing a lot at you and the audience, and I'm turning it over to you now to see where you'd like to probe a little further and what kind of angles interest you.
Go ahead, Emily.
Well, I want to get into, like I said, the 5 design flaws. And even because I had read a little bit about your work and read a little bit about your book. I haven't had a chance to read the whole book yet, but about, even you speaking about our brains, and that we as human beings do have all of these choices, and other animals not having those same choices. And I remember reading, of one of the design flaws, and maybe this was just me picking it out as one of the main ones, and it's not, but about this being functionally flexible.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, so we live in a world where we kind of have to be flexible, but then when is it too much, and how do we find that? Yeah, like where is that happy medium?
Yeah, good question. So you're absolutely right. Every feature of the human brain works very well and has certainly evolutionarily been extremely useful to us for survival. But in the wrong circumstances, that feature can morph into a flaw. So, for example, the one you're touching on is we, unlike other animals, have a great deal of functional flexibility. We can be quiet and introverted when it's appropriate. And we can be extroverted and outgoing when that's more appropriate, when it suits us. We can be aggressive in certain situations where we need to be. And we have a whole range, a whole repertoire of abilities to adapt to the room, so to speak, and morph ourselves into different kind of characters depending on the situation. We're one way with our boss, we're a different way with our spouse, we're a different way with our children, we're a different way with our neighbor, different way doing a podcast interview. And that's amazing. It's one of the amazing features of human flexibility. However, the cost of that is the flaw that all of these different aspects of ourselves can compete with each other. And we can suffer internal conflict in a way that no other animal can. We can second guess ourselves. We can torture ourselves over simple things like, I really want that second piece of cake, but I'm really trying to keep watch of my weight. Or I'm really tired. I don't feel like working out this morning, but I know I shouldn't make excuses because it'll become a habit. Or I want to blow up and explode and tell my boss what I really think of them, but I know that I want to keep my job. And listen, we saw it. What was it, 2 nights ago? An amazing example of this, right? Emily, you were out of town. I'm sure you've heard everyone's talking about how Will Smith completely lost control of his emotions to a point where, his career is going to suffer, having smacked Chris Rock on stage at the Academy Awards. And I'm sure that there's a lot of kind of torturous machinations going on in his head about, how could I have controlled that better? How did that happen? What should I do next? It was very interesting to see the process because he was very apologetic initially, but not to Chris Rock. It was only 2 days later, presumably under the influence and pressure of many of his handlers saying, you got to apologize to Chris Rock publicly because this is starting to go bad very fast. So that's kind of a little good example of how difficult it is for us to manage the various characters within ourselves. And let me touch quickly on the 5 flaws because you'd mentioned them, Emily. So the first is the feature of the human brain that works for us is we simplify everything. I've already touched on that. We couldn't otherwise. There's so much information coming at us all the time. We have to simplify our picture of the world in order to make decisions and get by. And that's great. That's served our purposes for eons, as I said, hundreds of thousands of years. But there's a risk that morphs into a flaw, which is oversimplifying, what I call greedy reductionism, which is a term the philosopher Dan Dennett used, which is we are so greedy in our desire to simplify the world, we reduce it to something that is so superficial, it doesn't really represent reality. And we especially do that with other people, right? We're very prone to simplifying the motives and the personalities of other people. We recognize the complexity in ourselves all the time. If we do something that we wish we hadn't, we've got a long list of excuses and reasons of why we were justified in doing it or why we were motivated to do it. When other people do things, the Will Smith being a good example, we just write them off as, oh, what a jerk. You know, we assign them personality labels without assigning them the complexity of the situations that they're within. So,
can I stop you right there for a second?
Go ahead.
On that, so would confirmation bias fit in this under this design flaw?
Absolutely. I would put, thank you for bringing that up. Confirmation bias does apply to it, but it applies more to the second flaw, which I'll talk to. Well, actually, let's segue to it right now, because I'm glad you brought that up. We are satisficers for the most part, which means that it's a psychological term coined by psychologist Herbert Simon. And what it means is we latch on to the first reasonable explanation we come up with that makes sense to us. When you're shopping for a new house, you can't look at all the houses on the market. You satisfice by looking for the house that meets your needs after a certain level of search. Same with buying a car. Same with dating or picking a lover that you want to spend the rest of your life with. You don't interview everyone on the planet. You have to satisfy by picking the one that comes along in a reasonable amount of time that takes your fancy. Well, we do the same thing with knowledge. As soon as we latch onto an explanation of something, like he's a jerk, rather than digging deeper for more understanding of what might have caused him to act that way, we're satisficing. And that helps us survive because we have to make...
I'm just wondering, I know we were going to get through the 5, but is it okay if we interject and just...
Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah.
So, because all these questions are coming to light.
Yeah, good.
But I'm just thinking of how, the first 2 that you've talked about, design flaws, really help explain in many ways, and I'm sure the other ones do as well, but like the what seems like the major polarization of views, of a what COVID-19 actually means. Do you vaccine or no vaccine, mask, no mask?
Yeah.
And it's almost like you have to retreat to this idea of satisficing, because I find it exhausting. Like I'm trying to make sense of things, and something fits and this other thing doesn't fit, and then I get information, and then we got these tribes that start to emerge, right? Because if you ask a question, well, you must be this way or this way, just in trying to get more information.
Yeah.
Does that fit at all for you?
It definitely fits, but what I would tweak is satisficing is when you lock down a conclusion early on in the process, which is appropriate much of the time, but it can morph into the flaw of overconfidence. Because when you're dealing with complexity and the vaccines, the pandemic, masks, social distancing, very complex set of dynamics. And our risk is being overconfident in the conclusions we draw on that. And the flaw is that we're addicted to certainty. We are literally addicted to certainty. That's the whole mechanism in satisfying thing, is that you lock down in your conclusion because we do not like, the human brain does not like the discomfort of not knowing, does not like the discomfort of feeling like the world's not in my control because I don't quite get it. So what I would tweak, Dave, is not that we have to rely on satisficing in those conditions, although we do. You're absolutely right. Ultimately, you make a decision to get the vaccine or not, wear the mask or not. But the more important element of fighting this certainty addiction is to suspend your willingness to lock down on conclusions. And so for those examples you gave related to COVID, I would say, well, the science is still evolving. We think we know a fair amount about the vaccines and the usefulness of masks and social distancing, but there's still a lot more to understand and dig and research on. And therefore, we have to be very careful about the conclusions we draw. and not consider any of what we hear as being final. So one thing I get nervous about, Dave, in the context of what you just raised, is when people say follow the science, because the science in general is evolutionary. Science, the process of science, is that it arrives at provisional truths that can be overridden and undermined over time as more research comes out. And that's how science works. So following the science, to me, essentially requires that we take what we know with a bit of a grain of salt, act on it to the best of our ability, but recognize that that's going to change because that's the nature of science. Science very, very rarely comes to a definitive, never to be challenged truth. And linking back to your point, Dave, that's where confirmation bias kicks in. Because we're so addicted to certainty, because we so desperately want to lock down our conclusions, we will grab any and every piece of evidence we can to support our conclusions. And that gives us the bias of confirming what we think is right. And that's very...
and ignoring anything that
challenges it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I find it such an interesting to be caught in that, like to catch yourself being caught in it, as an example, or to hear people you respect be caught in. And Emily and I both are executive coaches or leadership coaches.
I know.
And what I find really helps unlock that is when you really just listen to understand, not to necessarily agree with someone, but just to understand their perspective, right? Yeah. And often what I find, I don't know, Emily, if you find this, but I find it actually starts just shifting my perspective just because I'm listening, maybe without an agenda, or trying to anyways, to the degree I can. Do you agree with that, Emily? Have you noticed that at all?
Yeah, I do. And I think for me, it shows me the process that other people are going through, and that it is a process, and it is a conscious process of kind of stepping back, like how easy it is to, when we satisfy, then have those confirmation biases.
Yeah.
And that it can just be such a slippery slope from there, and taking that moment to then kind of step back and see, like, okay, what am I actually missing out on here? What information am I only wanting to hear versus that actively listening to all of the information?
And I'm guessing that is one of the hardest but most crucial elements of being an executive coach, is asking the questions that gently probe people to get them to think about what they're missing in the bigger picture. Because we all have we have these little not blindfolds, I forget, horses.
Blinders.
Thank you. We all have these blinders on. Thank you. That we see such a narrow perspective of the world that often to other people is conspicuously narrow. But as an executive coach, you don't want to be trampling on them and saying, wake up, see the bigger picture. So-and-so probably wasn't as nasty as you think he was. You're overreacting to this. You've got to be very adept at diplomatically asking the questions to let them expand their perspective.
What really helps, I find, is the less you know about the environment, the situation, the sector. Yeah. Because if I'm talking to someone, if I'm coaching someone around building a coaching business, which I've done over the last almost 17 years, I have a perspective, and I think I know the path, and it is really hard to let go of the path that I think a person should take. So I find it's been very valuable to work with like a lawyer or engineer or a heart surgeon, where you don't know their world, so you ask naturally, kind of. I'm not dumb, but just, questions, because and I often preface it with, like, this might sound a little offbeat or crazy, but, can I ask you the following thing? And sometimes that really can, that simple question, opens up a different perspective.
Yeah. Well, especially because with your client base, all the characters in their play, how the drama usually unfolds. I mean, I'm speaking for everyone. We all have these little plays in our head, right? Where we're the main character, we're the protagonist, everyone else is our antagonists. And we just think everyone's watching the same play that we are, which is the funny thing about human beings. But we're all in our own little plays. We're not watching other people's plays. We're watching our own little plays. And as an executive coach, I'm assuming you can get a bit caught up in the particular play, the drama that's unfolding with that client, and you think, yeah, I know all these characters, I know how everything works, and you could almost get sucked into their version of reality if you're not careful. It's a very delicate balancing act between not buying into their play entirely, but also being very handling them very gingerly and diplomatically, so that you build their trust. So you're not constantly they're not feeling like they're being constantly challenged by you and second guessed by you. One thing I'll just quickly add in here. So for each of the 5 features that turn into 5 flaws, I have fixes. And the only reason this came to mind is because one of the key fixes for both oversimplifying and overconfidence is asking questions. And most of us are not very good question askers. We want to jump to solutions. We think, again, it's satisfying a certainty addiction. Even as an executive coach, we think, okay, I see what's going on here, and I've got to help my client see the true reality or the big picture. And the best way to really get to Emily, you mentioned the missing information. There's always missing information, always, always, always. The best way to get to that missing information is through really adept question probing. And I think questions are underutilized. My experience is less on the executive coaching side and more on the corporate director side. And I find corporate directors don't ask enough really good probing questions. You know, they might be too willing to accept whatever management says, or on the other hand, they might be too determined to ask questions that are challenging just for the point of being challenging. They are not information seeking, missing information seeking, open perspective geared type questions. So I think question asking is a real art form that clearly is one of the main tools that you'd be using for executive coaching. And I think something that all of us can share no matter what the role we have. In particular, sorry, I'm rambling here. One more point and then I'll shut up and let you ask some questions. In our romantic relationships, like everything that we've talked about, whether it's executive coaching, corporate directorships, I find are really useful in our close relationships, not just romantic necessarily, our familial relationships, our relationships with our friends, but especially with someone that you're spending a lot of time with. You tend to make a lot of assumptions about, you think you understand the drama in their heads because you've been down this road many times. You're not as inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt or ask the kind of questions that you might for other people in your lives. And so I think a lot of these learnings are very applicable to the romantic relationships that we treasure so much in our lives.
Yeah. And with that, I find personally that is the, Dave, you touched on, it's so much easier to stay curious when we don't know someone.
Yeah.
Because we honestly don't know. But when it is a personal relationship, then I'll speak for myself. Yeah. Have these assumptions of how someone's going to react. This is a trigger. This is what this person's going to do. This is how this is going to go. Yeah. And then often for myself, I've been aware of how am I not holding space to allow the other person, whether it's a partner, one of my siblings, to respond differently. And instead of me just waiting to hear what I think I know is going to be said or their point of view. And in touching on, you speaking about the leadership role, and one of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading about your work was you referencing them as chief conversation facilitators.
Yes. Thank you for bringing up that's exactly what I view the leader of today, the most publicized, the least discussed, but crucial ability, talent for any leader today is being a very good facilitator of conversations. Because I liked how you picked up on it earlier, Emily, when you said there's missing information, because it's one of the key elements in the book that I state right up front, that if you accept the premise that we simplify everything, then the corollary to that is there's always missing information. And so as your role as in a leader's role, you want and need to uncover that missing information to make good decisions. And the only way you can do that is by facilitating really genuine, constructive conversations with the team you're working with, so that that missing information is revealed. And that ability to be the facilitator of a constructive conversation where there is conflict and disagreement, but it's not personal, it's more about the issues and not the people, where you're avoiding groupthink, right? Which is our inclination when we get into groups, is just to coalesce around a viewpoint. That's an underappreciated skill. I think too few leaders today, unfortunately, political, industrial, commercial, nonprofits, have really developed that ability to facilitate the kind of conversations we need when we're dealing with all of these kind of complex problems, climate change, pandemic, you name it. Look at we're in a very difficult situation now with Russia. I don't envy the people that are on a day-to-day basis trying to figure out what move to play in this game theoretical scenario that's coming to life before our very eyes. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think the ability to facilitate conversations is a leadership skill that we need to be talking a lot more about these days.
A comment. I want to get to the other design flaws here before we.
Yes.
Yes. But before that, I was just going to, if I could comment on one thing. It's funny, like when you work with teams, that whole idea of groupthink, and this real, and I mean, I'm very guilty of this as well. But you want to jump to solution really quickly, and I'll warn the team ahead of time. Say, okay, we're going to go through some steps here, and you have to go through all these steps before you come to solution, and people will get actually agitated with me and almost kind of angry, because like, no, this is the answer right here. Yeah. And what I understand, I'd like to hear your perspective, and then we can get into the other design flaws, is I think cognitively, I read once that or a couple times, I believe, that we're really hardwired. Like, it feels good to come up with a solution.
Yeah.
And if it's the wrong solution, right, it's just a solution, and there's some hit of dopamine as a result of that, I believe.
Absolutely. You're spot on. And it's the exact inverse, the other side of the coin of what I said maybe 10 minutes ago, which is we abhor uncertainty. We abhor the discomfort of not knowing and not understanding and feeling we're out of control. I usually use the analogy of you're in a car, you're driving, you'd get this in New Brunswick, you'd get it in Ontario, you lose control on the ice and your heart just stops and you freeze. And until you get traction, you don't relax. But once you get traction, wow, do you feel good? And it's the same thing with a complex problem or something that's pressing that you don't understand. It's the same kind of like, what's going on here? It's a very uncomfortable feeling. And once you get traction by understanding, then you calm down. But the problem is that your understanding might not be the real understanding. Again, it comes down to satisfying. If you can latch onto something that makes sense, you get that comfortable feeling of traction. You get that dopamine hit, as you say, Dave, of, oh, it's all good now. I'm comfortable. I'm in control because I understand. But, when it comes to complex situations, of which we have too many today, we often really don't see the whole picture. We don't really understand. We just want the adrenaline hit or the dopamine hit, I should say, of feeling that we've got it all under control.
In fact, and to use your metaphor, you might get traction, but your car's facing the wrong way.
That's nice. I like that. I like that. That's good. Can I use that, Dave? Can I use that? That is really good.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Vale.
No. Please attribute it to the boiling point. We want all the listeners that we can get. So what are the other design flaws? Just to quickly.
Okay, so just quickly, we covered oversimplifying. We covered overconfidence. The third one we touched on is overreacting. I'll just say a quick word on it. We can do a deep dive on what I'll do is I'll mention the last three, and then you can follow up with any kind of questions you want, any of them. Overreacting has the genesis of a negativity bias. So for us, pain is more painful than pleasure is pleasurable. A criticism, if someone gives you a compliment, that'll last an hour or two. It'll make you feel good. If someone criticizes you, probably 2 or 3 days, you'll still be stinging from it and thinking about it. So again, I won't go into a lot of detail now, but negative is more than positive for us. That's how we are designed. We are designed that way. And that is, keeps us out of trouble and keeps us alive. But boy, that can create a lot of difficulty for us. The next fourth of 5 is we've already talked about. We have great ability to be functionally flexible. We can be different characters in different situations. But the flaw is that we compete with ourselves. We suffer from internal conflict that could be quite torturous for us in a way that no other animal shares. And then the 5th is a little more cerebral, and we probably don't have time to go into much detail of it today, but it's actually one of the ones that I find most interesting, is that the feature is that we make sense of everything. We are very quick at taking in information and coming up with conclusions, sometimes prematurely, but we're kind of an information processing machine. But the flaw is that we struggle with bigger questions that we don't have easy answers for, like what is the meaning of life? And what should I be doing with my life? And we take our information processing systems too far in trying to come up with solutions that aren't necessarily useful for us in terms of bigger questions about how to spend our lives, what the meaning of life is, what happens when we die. And there are fixes for this as well. Again, I should emphasize, none of these fixes are Ted Cadsby's fixes. I'm not smart enough or creative enough to solve all of the world's problems, let alone the human problems. But I do have an ability to corral other people's ideas, philosophers, psychologists, scientists, neurologists. And that's the essence of my work, and the essence of my book is bringing all those ideas to bear on these problems.
I love it. Emily, why don't you, I know you've got probably a really excellent question, and then I can do a follow-up to that, and then we can wrap the interview up, because believe it or not, it's amazing how quickly time goes. And I feel like we need a lot more time with Ted.
I know. I want the rest of the week. We haven't even fixed. Now, I'm just grateful to know I only have 5 flaws.
That's right.
That seems manageable.
Yeah.
But Dave, you touched on it earlier, that dopamine hit. And then Ted, how we get that dopamine hit by being negative. So no wonder so many people love to stay stuck in that negativity. And it just it blows my mind that just about that concept of that pain is more painful than pleasure is pleasurable. Yeah.
And we over ruminate as a result. We just torture ourselves going over and over and over the injustices we've suffered and the wrongs that people have done. And we get into little tribes, right? That then start fighting with other little tribes, the political left versus the political right, the climate deniers versus the climate alarmists, the anti-vaxxers versus the vaxxers. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. Just one of the little tricks that I've found extremely helpful for myself in my life that I picked up on my reading and research and my interviewing of academics is to constantly ask myself throughout the day, how much does this matter? So if someone cuts me off when I'm driving, or butts in front of me in front of a line, or bumps into me accidentally, or says something that I interpret in a negative way, my inkling is to overreact because I'm a human being. And I have to catch myself and say, how much does this really matter? Will I remember this tomorrow, next week, 10 years from now? Can I let this go because it doesn't matter? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is this really doesn't matter that much. And just pausing to ask myself that all-important question, how much does this matter, kind of opens the world for me a bit and pulls me above myself. It helps me self-distance, right? Distance helps me get out of my own little drama, my own little play, and look at me and look at myself from above and just say, Ted, this issue that you're stewing about, that you're angry about, that you're losing sleep over, let it go, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, sorry, Dave. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to go ahead, Emily. I was just going to say that takes a lot of discipline.
It does. And again, we're running out of time. All of this stuff takes a lot of discipline. The macro solution is what I call the space between. You've got to be able to pull yourself into the space between stimulus and response, right? We get stimulated by something, often very negatively because we have a negativity bias, and we need the ability to jump into a little protective space where we can take a breath and pull ourselves up from bird's eye perspective and do some real human type special thinking that allows us the kind of freedoms that Emily was talking about earlier. So that's kind of the macro solution to the human dilemma is finding an ability to get yourself into the space between, so that your responses to the world are more well thought through and more useful to you than the immediate responses that would come without a space between.
Yeah, we talked earlier about my last 90 hours of travel, and what a prime example of seeing that than in an airport. Yeah. When people have missed connections. Oh, you're going for another PCR test. Oh, you've been randomly checked for whatever. And, I traveled home with a good friend of mine, Monica Adair, who's a listener of The Boiling Point and has been on this before. And her and I, we had so many little hiccups happen over the last 90 hours and we see people in similar situations overreacting, being negative. And, her and I, we laughed through it all, because it's just like, this is life right now. And we have the choice of okay, are we going to fill out this form again? Regardless, it needs to be done. Are we going to get down on ourselves and be angry at the person? Or are we just going to carry on and do it? And if we can approach so many more of those situations in life, which takes a conscious choice to do that. And it's not always easy at times, especially when you're tired. Oh gosh. And I'm just how much more enjoyable it makes an experience.
Or how less painful. It doesn't, what you just described doesn't sound enjoyable at all, but I guess much less painful than all the people that are around you that were torturing themselves about how awful the situation was.
Yeah.
Well, kudos to you. That's amazing. I don't know if I could have pulled that off, to be honest. Even with all my research and writing and thinking about this every day and talking to people every day, I hate to say it, I might have been one of those people melting down. It would have taken, Dave, you're absolutely right. The amount of discipline it takes. And again, Emily, maybe because I know you're you were a very serious cyclist. So you obviously are able to delve into depths of discipline that many of us are not necessarily capable of doing. And maybe that reflected itself in your ability to be disciplined about how you handle that situation, because Dave is spot on. The amount of discipline it takes to be mindful of those situations and how you are vulnerable to torturing yourselves and how you have the freedom to not torture yourselves. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of practice.
Well, and there's all these, as you pointed out, Emily, like those triggers of lack of sleep, or for me, a big one is I get hangry. Oh my God, when I'm hungry, literally, people that know me well will say, Dave, go get something to eat, because I'm just being unreasonable, and I'm even feeling myself being reasonable, and it's like I can't stop. It's crazy.
Those are the two biggies: sleep and food. You're absolutely right.
Okay, well that's because I am really bad about food. What I was just gonna make a comment, and then I think it would be great for you if you could to share where people can find your materials.
Sure.
And you but I was thinking of this idea of, I don't know if it connects completely with overreaction. I think it does, but I'm just watching the interest rate creep up, or the potential for it. And in a variable mortgage. And so immediately my reaction is lock in, right? And then someone patiently explained to me in a way that I hadn't thought about what the benefit of that may not be, may not be the benefit I'm looking for.
Right.
I should say we actually, it's not just my mortgage, but it was just information that was required, but it had been left to my own, myself and making a decision. I would have made a decision that probably, and I guess we could debate this, but it's just funny how often that shows up in different things, And
absolutely. We want quick solutions. That's what our brain are designed for. And that worked brilliant for us for thousands of years on the savannah, where we need to make quick hunting decisions, quick survival decisions. And in fact, it worked very well for us for, over 10,000 years as farmers. But in today's world, we can't abandon it. That's what makes this so difficult. We can't abandon you pointed it out, Dave, the satisfying, it works for us much of the time. So we can't abandon it. But there are an exploding number of situations today where it doesn't suit. And we have to become more adept at recognizing that our intuitive, quick responses don't work in these certain circumstances. And so that's another element of the discipline you were talking about, being able to recognize when you are acting and thinking too quickly and reacting too quickly, versus when it's helpful and it's okay to be doing that.
So we've gone well over what we typically go, and I know we could go way deeper. And I think this would be a perfect place to end. How do people learn more about you, find your book?
Yeah.
Get you on a podcast, all that good stuff.
That's very kind of you. I'll keep it very simple. The book is Hard to Be Human. It's available wherever you get your books, Amazon, Indigo, fine bookstores everywhere. I think I'm on Twitter and YouTube, but I think the simplest way to reach me is through my website, tedcadsby.com. The last name is Cadsby, tedcadsby.com. And everything about me and my work is on the website. So that's the easiest way to reach me.
Ted, you are, I love your passion, for the topic. What an enjoyable guest you are. Thank you so much for reaching out. And I don't know, I've said this to, many guests, but this is, this is one of those conversations that I just feel like we could continue to have, maybe a part 2 at some point.
Well, maybe we can have a follow-up sometime.
Yeah. Emily, I'll let you take us out.
Yeah, I think with that, I was just thinking, Ted, of you make it easy to actively listen.
Oh, that's sweet. That's a nice compliment. That's a nice compliment. Thank you.
And of those 5 words of there is always something missing.
Yeah.
And absolutely. How if we can apply those 5 words to so many different aspects of our life, of even in that moment of you feel that trigger and you're about to react, of just taking that second to ask what is missing here.
Yeah. Thank you. The very nice compliment and a real pleasure to join you today. I'm a fan of the show, and I was thrilled that you asked me to come on, and I'm glad it worked out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We're going to let Genevieve tell the listeners how to, all the stuff about how to find us and all that stuff.
Yeah. So if you're like Ted and a friend of yours has sent along our podcast and you're looking to find out more, you can head over to our website, boilingpointpodcast.com. You'll see all of our different previous conversations and episodes there. You can listen on any of your favorite podcast channels or platforms. You can also find us on social media, so on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you'd like to watch the video versions, you can find them on Facebook and YouTube. And a big help, which Dave mentioned as well, is you can share this out with your friends. So be like Ted's friend, send it along to somebody else. And maybe if it's something that you're interested in, drop us a note and we can maybe have you on as a guest.
Well done. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Ted.
Bye-bye. Get some sleep, Emily.
Yes.
Thanks, Ted. Take care. Be in touch.
Thanks for listening to the Boiling Point Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite listening platform. To find out more, head to our website at boilingpointpodcast.com. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. To find out more about Dave Vale's work, head over to visioncoachinginc.com. Thanks for listening, and make sure to check out our next conversation.